All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another session of our evolution seminar series. I need to briefly note that we need to be out of this room at 1:20 today. My understanding is we're still going to leave a little bit of time for questions in this room. With that, I'm happy to introduce our speaker today. Benjamin Zuckerberg is a professor in the Department of Forest and Wildlife Ecology here at UW-Madison. He's come to share some really fascinating research on how broad environmental dynamics can influence ecology and evolution. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Zuckerberg.
Great. Yeah, thanks everyone for the invitation to come talk to you today. And what I plan on talking about is this idea ultimately of climate dipoles and how they might impact ecological and potentially even evolutionary dynamics. And before I begin, though, of course, I really want to acknowledge the people that do all the hard work in my lab, my graduate students and postdocs. They're really the force behind this. I'm just here to claim credit for it all. But also my collaborators too, Jeanine LaMontagne, as well as Court Strong, who have been really crucial partners in all this. This is a project that was funded by NSF Macro Systems, and we're in the final year of it. We're just kind of wrapping up. So I won't kind of belabor you with, information on climate change and what we know. I think a lot of us in this audience kind of know a lot of those general trends and some of the signals we know that climate change is in fact occurring at a fairly rapid and unprecedented pace. But one of the things that we're continuously concerned about, from especially climate scientists, is this idea that we are sort of meeting this planetary tipping point, sort of leaving the stable climate system that has been sort of the late Holocene, the last 10,000 years. And we're kind of quickly getting to this sort of threshold where we're going to enter this new epoch of the climate system that's going to be Earth, that is characterized by much warmer temperatures than we've experienced over the last 10,000 years. Certainly the higher prevalence of mega droughts and forest fires, shifting in earlier phenology, and the loss of snow covers around many parts of the Northern Hemisphere. But one of the more important aspects of this is also that we're going to see a shift and a change in climate variability. And so just to kind of provide a little bit of context of what I mean by climate variability is that I think we're all pretty much aware and understand that when we see changes in temperature and precipitation that occur from day to day, that's generally codified as this idea of weather, right? From one day to the next, we're going to see changes in those climate components or those components of temperature and rainfall. And then when we think about climate change, we're thinking about sort of average conditions and how those may change over decades, if not centuries. Climate variability is kind of right in the middle there. It's generally what we think about in terms of changes in temperature and precipitation occurring on sort of months, sort of interannual timescales. But they are a really important feature of the climate system. And in particular, the work that I do, we've well known that for a long time, that climate variability is really important in terms of governing and certainly in training ecological processes. So when we think about modes of climate variability, so these are repeated patterns of climate variability like El Nino, La Nina, this is sort of captured by the ENSO index, that we know from an ecological perspective that those sort of broader climate modes can in fact influence local temperatures, right? So when you have these sort of changes in the climate system that can impact these very localized changes in temperature and precipitation, which then, as you can imagine, can have very direct effect on species in terms of their populations, maybe their demography, maybe for birds, their migration, survival, all those different components that might be directly influenced by those changes in local temperature. And at the same time, as you can imagine, there could also be these indirect effects, right? Where you got fluctuations in local temperature that influence some sort of resource that the species are depending on. And so you have this sort of indirect pathway by which you see these fluctuations in temperature and rainfall that might then influence the species or their populations. And this is something that's been fairly well documented, certainly in the bird literature that I've been sort of working on for the last several years. But, for decades, we've always sort of recognized that these changes in some sort of mode of climate variability like ENSO, over time can certainly influence the timing of ecological phenomenon, right? So potentially during an El Nino event, you might have in some cases, let's say, an earlier ecological response or migration pattern or the arrival to a breeding ground. And at the same time, we recognize that really what's underlying this is that you have these fluctuations over time in temperature and precipitation that can also induce these sort of temporally variant ecological responses. So whether or not it's a very hot year or potentially a very dry year can clearly influence the timing of these ecological responses and phenomena. And we also recognize that that timing can influence it indirectly, right? So some sort of change in the local temperature from one year to the next can influence the timing, the periodicity, and some sort of resource availability, which has these sort of other effects and proliferation to these ecological responses. So although I know that we've sort of shown this in sort of what we know in terms of ecological responses over time, to me, the area that we really have not explored very much is the idea that climate variability in of itself, in its conceptualization, is both a spatial and a temporal process. So we know that if you look at sort of climate change trends, that there's a lot of noise from one year to the next, and that obviously encompasses this idea of variability in that system. What we also are beginning to recognize is that that variability, one, has a periodicity to it in many cases, and also has a spatial nature to it. So for example, we've got two sort of well-known modes of climate variability. One is the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. The other is the El Nino Southern Oscillation, or ENSO. And really what you're seeing there is sort of driving these modes is this fluctuation in sea surface temperatures across the Pacific, right? And with clear geographic structure to it, where potentially one year you might have warmer temperatures in the Eastern Pacific, and another year that may be less so. And what you see there, not just is the geography of that, but the periodicity of that also fluctuates. So PDO operates much more, as the name implies, it's sort of a decadal oscillation process, where something like ENSO, it's much more kind of 3 to 5 year, what they refer to as quasi-periodicity. But ultimately, this is an important feature of climate variability, namely that there's spatial and temporal dynamics that are playing a role. So why is that important? Well, it's important because when we talk about ecological processes, there's oftentimes a component of this that we refer to as spatial synchrony. Namely that when we think about changes in temperature and precipitation, if you're thinking about sort of how autocorrelated those temperatures, those changes are sort of spatially and geographically, what we do know is that they tend to be autocorrelated at roughly about 2,000 kilometers. What that basically means is that if you're in one location and 2,000 kilometers away, you're at another location, generally speaking, you're kind of experiencing those same changes in temperature and precipitation overall. As you kind of pull those two locations farther and farther apart, they're less autocorrelated, right? So we know that when we see changes in the climate system, and particularly when we see changes in climate variability, there is a sort of geographic autocorrelation that's happening underlying those processes. So why is that important? Well, from an ecological perspective, this idea of spatial synchrony then is that there's these fundamental components in the climate system in terms of fluctuations in temperature and precipitation that tend to be sort of autocorrelated in time and space, can impose that same kind of synchrony in certain populations of species that might be experiencing those temperatures. So for example, in just this sort of theoretical example, if you've got three populations, let's say of a bird here, and you're thinking about some sort of aspect of their life history, whether it's demography, survival, reproduction, that they're all kind of potentially experiencing, even though they're in these disjunct populations, the same conditions, and potentially be synchronizing then all those different processes that might be important for their populations. Okay, so climate variability really is this distinct component of the climate system. It has both time and space to it. And another important feature and characteristic of climate variability that I really spent a lot of time thinking about is this idea of climate dipoles. So when we think about climate dipoles, really what it is, it's an inherent feature of climate variability in which you get the emergence and persistence of two opposite sort of polarized conditions of temperature and or precipitation, right? So in this sort of example here, you might have sort of wet cold conditions over in the northwest, and at the same exact time, you've got warm, dry conditions over there in the southeast. And then we also have this sort of what's referred to as a biogeographic fulcrum, which is kind of this tipping point. So you can imagine a seesaw that sets up. What's really interesting about climate dipoles is that that may be one condition, But in a different time period, they flip, right? So now in a different time period, you basically have those warm, dry conditions that set up in the Northwest. And at the exact same time, you've got these colder, wet conditions in the Southeast. So in terms of sort of this known characteristic of climate variability, then there's actually a lot of good examples of sort of the exact phenomenon of climate dipoles, right? So just shown here, we have the winter La Nina pattern, right? We've got in this condition, we've got this variable polar jet stream, and we've got colder, wet conditions that set up in the Northwest. Down here, we've got warmer, drier conditions in the Southeast. But what happens during an El Nino? You got the reverse of that climate dipole, right? So now you've got sort of these warmer conditions that set up in the Northwest, and you've got these colder conditions out there in the Southeast. So from sort of, in terms of sort of this idea, this characteristic of climate variability, climate dynamicists and climate scientists have sort of always recognized these climate dipoles exist. But what I've always been interested in is how they might actually entrain ecological dipoles. And so when we talk about this concept of ecological dipoles, really what we are talking about is that there are this sort of climate dipole that might be persisting that's associated with a certain mode of climate variability, let's say ENSO or North Atlantic oscillation. But no matter what, you've got some sort of dipole that sets up. And if you're a species, and maybe you have sort of three populations there that are sort of just shown conceptually in these sort of three different circles, you can imagine that if you're a species that actually does pretty well during warmer conditions, that in time period one, that these two populations there, the one in the green and the orange, are kind of synced up. They're synchronized. They're doing pretty well. Let's say it's survival or it's reproduction, right? Whereas the other population in the green over there is experiencing a condition that's suboptimal, right? It's colder conditions, generally not doing quite as well. And so you get this sort of inverted pattern that sets up. But of course, as we just learned, is that as these sort of phasing and these changes in that climate variability system manifest themselves, you could actually see this dipole setting up where you get the flipping of that and you get the inversion of that relationship. So now you got sort of this ecological dipole that's setting up that also is temporally variant and changing over time. But really what's driving it is that underlying climate dipole. And of course, this can kind of persist over different time periods, and I'll kind of touch on this a little bit, is that periodicity may change with respect to however that climate dipole actually manifests and emerges. Okay, so that kind of sets the framework a little bit in terms of conceptually, sort of whether or not climate dipoles can entrain ecological dipoles, and are there actually any good ecological systems by which we can test this, we can explore this. So the group of species that I really spent a lot of time thinking about are these birds, these boreal bird species. And so these are species that generally occupy a residence, kind of you can imagine up in the boreal forests of Canada, but kind of dip down into the upper Midwest as well. So this is a really fascinating group of species in the fact that they actually do this really weird and unique behavior called eruptions. So when we talk about bird migration, you can think about bird migration sort of existing along sort of a spectrum. So what we would sort of know as seasonal migration, right? The robins showing up in spring and setting up their breeding grounds. But on the other end of that, and a very predictable migration, is what's referred to as facultative migration. And so in facultative migration, that's basically still kind of a form of movement and migration that's oftentimes seen, but it's much less regular, and it happens sometimes in a periodic fashion, but it's unpredictable in many ways. And so for boreal birds, many of them show this type of eruptive behavior, which is really widespread. They'll kind of move out of Canada and they'll go sometimes all the way down to Mexico during a particular winter. It's very synchronized, so it's not just kind of happening in one population. It's tended to include a whole set of populations, and there is some periodicity to it. There are also this idea of superflights, where it's not just one individual species. We're talking about multiple species that are actually all doing this kind of eruption dynamic together. So it's really interesting to note that this is a very highly visible ecological phenomenon. So people feed their birds, right? There are 35 million people in this country that actually feed their birds in their backyards. We'll see this in certain winters where, potentially they'll look at their kitchen window and suddenly their feeders are dripping with these birds, hundreds of them, that wouldn't normally be there in any given winter year, right? And so in this case, we got pine sixkins, and it's not unusual during an eruption year to suddenly look outside and see hundreds of them just completely devouring food and emptying your bird feeders. And part of this dynamic is that siskins in particular kind of moving all the way down from the boreal forest, again, sometimes all the way down to Mexico and southeastern parts of the United States. And what's interesting about this is not just sort of the geography of that, but also sort of the frequency of it, that there is some potential periodicity to this with some of these bird species. So here we have redpolls, and this is looking at feeder sites within the Northeast, and you can see almost like a quasi-biannual rhythm to their eruption dynamics, where they'll start showing up sometimes going from anywhere to 10% of the feeders suddenly showing up 30, 40, or 50% of the feeders during a given eruption year. And so this is sort of a really interesting phenomenon that's really displayed by a whole suite of different species. So we've got species from, what we normally think about as chickadees, a very common bird, they will erupt in some years. And then all the way to very unique species like red crossbill. So there's a whole group of species that will kind of show these eruptive-like behaviors. So to me, thinking about it, bird eruptions are this really interesting ecological phenomenon to think about in the sense that, one, it's clearly an example of facultative migration. They don't have to do this every year. Why do they do that? It's a very sort of broad scale and synchronized phenomenon. And we really are talking about the movement outside of what would be normally their resident or normal range. And so there's always been these questions as to sort of what's driving this. What are the almost push-pull dynamics that might be sort of making it such that a species may want to leave that winter resident area and go to a whole entirely new area? And two of the kind of components that people thought about are climate and resource availability. In particular, they've really been thinking about this in a sense, and we have been since the 1960s really, that there must be something that's underlying this in terms of variation in climate and resources that can be driving these very well-known migratory pathways for these species. So I'm going to unpack two of those hypotheses, okay? The first is this idea of a climate variability hypothesis. And this is really much more along the lines of sort of this push dynamic. Namely that when you've got sort of very cold conditions, and you can all imagine we've all experienced sort of a polar vortex here in Wisconsin, right? When you got these very cold conditions that set up across Canada, that you can imagine sort of pushing these birds out of what would be their normal resident wintering range, and they're fleeing those conditions, trying to find a more suitable, optimal condition, right? And so, if you looked at something like temperature, you would imagine that during a very cold year, that's when you would see these big eruptive movements happening, where thousands of individuals are just getting out of Dodge, right? They are just leaving, trying to find more suitable conditions. However, as this alternative hypothesis here is that many of these species are what's referred to as seed dependent, okay? Meaning that the main resource that they take advantage of are seeds. And they've really put in a lot of evolutionary capital into this, in the sense that they've just demonstrated a lot of behavioral modifications to take advantage of seed. Many of them will actually regurgitate seed to their young, which is like totally bonkers in the bird world. That many of them have developed morphological traits, like, for example, we've got the crossbill here. They have a cross mandible. Why do they have a cross mandible? They do it to actually pry open pine cones and actually get to that seed. So if you're talking about traits that have evolved over time to take advantage of a food resource, I don't think you can think of one better than cross mandibles for crossbills. The other is demographic responses, that many of these birds, during sort of lots of seed in the environment, will actually do really well reproductively. They'll actually have multiple nests, right? Whereas during years when maybe they don't have as much seed, they don't reproduce at all. And so you will have a lot of this sort of their life history framework that's really governed and tied into this idea of seed dependency. So why is this potentially an important component then? Well, seed in of itself is highly dynamic as well. And so there's a phenomenon, another one, also referred to as massing. And so when we talk about massing, the idea is that in some years you get lots of seed production. For example, in the spruce here, you can see that there's definitely years of massed year in which these branches are just laden, dripping with cone crop, right? And so part of this that happens is that when they have these sort of mass boom years, there's a lot of seed in the environment, but almost always following a mass year, you get complete seed failure. right? You get a big production of seed and reproduction in trees, but in the following year, you get the bust. So you have this boom and bust dynamic that sets up that also, as you can kind of see here, has a sort of quasi-periodicity to it too, right? We're talking about sometimes 3-4 years or so, boom, you get a big mass here. The other important component of this mass is that it's spatially synchronized, meaning that when you go outside and you see your spruce, let's say in your own backyard, it's not just your spruce that's doing that. What they've shown is that populations of species are oftentimes synchronized in their massing up until about 1,500 or 2,000 kilometers apart. So this is a very big geographic phenomenon as well. And furthermore, what they've shown is that masting itself has a dipole. So that when they actually look at tree and seed production here, you can see in some years, you get masting that's happening over there in the Northeast. At the same time, no masting going on over the West. And there's been really cool studies that have suggested that what's driving that is climate. That when you get conditions that set up right before mass year in terms of very dry, warm conditions, it kind of sets it all up for the mass the following year. And that's what's really driving that dipole in the massing. So given all that together, right, we've got the climate variability hypothesis, the competing hypothesis, is that's really resource availability. And when we sort of play this out, then what we are talking about is that you've got mass seeding in the environment, you got lots of seed being produced, you got a species and set of species that are trying to take advantage of that resource and that's availability of that resource. They got lots of young birds, high recruitment in the environment. You get an abundant population that's really responding to that masting. And then, boom, you got the bust. You got all these young birds in the environment, all of them doing really well, and then there's no food. And what happens then? Then you got that eruption, right? And again, you can imagine that time lag is when you see an eruption event, really all of it's being set up almost 2 years before you even get that eruption event. So what I'm going to show you is some of the work that we've been doing sort of hot off the presses, in fact, as the sort of project is wrapping up, trying to address this question is, do climate dipoles directly and or indirectly then entrain ecological dipoles and bird eruptions? And so I'll kind of walk you some of our recent work on this and think about then sort of what might be some broader implications of ecological dipoles. So I'm not going to get into methods too much. I don't want to bore you with all that, but I do want to kind of tell you where the data are coming from. So I work a lot with citizen science data sets, and this is a program I'm very familiar with called Project Feeder Watch. So Project Feeder Watch is a citizen science program that's been running since really the early 1990s. It's managed through the Cornell Lab of Ornithology and Bird Studies Canada. Each one of those points on this map is a Feeder Watch participant. Okay, so there's well over 25,000 people or so that every year watch the birds in their backyard and record what species are showing up every week. And these are 2-day count periods, and they kind of record this. They're very devoted to this. And it's actually the perfect type of data set to look at eruptions, right? Because ultimately, you got a big data set that's millions and millions of observations, and you're getting this for a lot of different species. So we were kind of focusing on this group of species coming into it, where the Feeder Watch data set is perfectly set up for capturing these eruption dynamics, and not just sort of when they happen, but where they happen. So the approach that we use for this, and again, I'm not going to get into the details, but it's something called empirical orthogonal function analysis, so EOF. And the only thing I really want you to come away from this is that the thing and the strength of EOF is that you can take basically geographic patterns, in this case of bird abundance that may vary from year to year, and actually see how that might change over time. So how might the spatial patterning of that sort of abundance map or those distribution of birds change over time? And it's a really good approach for actually identifying these dipoles. So for example, just kind of walk you through one example, we've got pine siskin here. Okay, so pine siskin may, let's say, think about it, may show a dipole in sort of where they show up in terms of these eruption years, right? Where potentially you got lots of birds here in the southern part of the United States as they erupt down, and maybe now you've got fewer birds kind of in the northern part. And so the interesting component of EOF is that you can see whether or not the strengths of that pattern emerges at different times or different years. So when it's positive, it generally suggests that you're getting this pattern And when it's negative, you're kind of getting the inverse of that pattern. So let's look at some real data. So this is from Project Feeder Watch data. This is in one given year, an eruption event. And you can see lots of birds showing up in the southern part of the United States. And so this would kind of show us then sort of be shown in that positive framing of that index end. You get these very high positive values. If we show another variation, of this, where you get these sort of fewer birds showing up, then in the southern United States, this is not an eruption year, and this would generally be those negative values. So the advantage of this kind of approach is you can look at that spatial pattern and how it varies over time. So in this case, looking at from 1990, all the way to 2020, again, focusing on pine siskins, you can start seeing some periodicity there in terms of when those eruptions occur. For example, that eruption geography where you get lots of birds showing up in the southern part of the United States. This is kind of what we found in 1990 and 2009. Those were big eruption years where that pattern really emerges as we see these birds coming down into the southern part of the United States. And we definitely have this other pattern where they're not erupting. And that would be pretty typical, let's say, of 2004, where there's kind of those birds are not present. They are not showing up at those feeders during that particular year. And some years we'll definitely have years that are almost random noise in a sense that we're getting some action going on in some parts, but not in other parts. And so it's centering more along zero. It's not really showing a strong pattern in either way. So what we found right off the bat, actually, for many of these species is kind of two main dipoles that were operating when we talk about eruption dynamics. One of them was this very latitudinal dipole, where we get lots of birds showing up in one area, especially sort of along this north-south gradient. And the other, was this sort of east-west dipole, this longitudinal dipole that kind of we see for many of these species as well. So then the question is, what happens when we incorporate climate variability as a potential explainer or predictor of when we start seeing these dipoles? And certainly when we look at minimum temperature, we actually found, again, these very discrete dipoles that set up where you get sort of warmer temperatures in one area and cooler temperatures in another. You kind of see this in 2 different years. But in terms of this other phenomena or this other potential component is masting. And so to get to this, we actually used a fairly new database called MASTIF. And what these are basically long-term records of seed production that have been going back since the 1950s, really. But we have such a unique and big database right now, we can actually start interpolating and extrapolating where you start seeing masting events. And so what you can see here in these 2 examples is, again, this other dipole, just in terms of tree seed production, where you get sort of this east-west dipole where they're not masting in some areas, but they are masting in other areas. So we wanted to kind of bring these 2 data sets to bear to try and look at these 2 hypotheses of climate variability or resource variability. And what I would say is that the climate variability hypothesis is pretty straightforward, right? They're generally not in areas where it's really cold, and potentially they're more likely to be associated with areas that are very warm with any given year. In terms of the resource variability, there's kind of 2 sort of nuanced versions of these predictions. One of them is sort of what's referred to as the boom prediction, meaning that the birds are actually seeking out areas with lots of seed in any given eruption year, right? They kind of figure it out that there's a lot of seed over there. That's where they're going to end up during that eruption year. The bust is a little bit more nuanced. It means that they basically are fleeing areas in which there was a lot of seed the year before, because we know that it's going to be a bust year. So in this case, they're basically have this time lag where they are leaving areas, or they're not going to be in areas where the year before there was a bunch of mast in the environment. And really what that's driving them is this bust. So to explore this, we use something called a maximum covariance analysis. Again, I won't bore you with the details, but ultimately, really what you're trying to do is seeing how these different spatial patterns basically link up over time and over space. And so in this case, bringing both the temperature data as well as the masking data to see whether or not these 2 drivers could actually be important for actually then constraining where eruption dynamics are taking place. So I'll show you some results here. So here we have a white-winged crossbill. Okay, and this is a species that we found to actually be pretty sensitive to that temperature gradient and that temperature dipole. So what you can see there over there is basically on the right, you've got their abundance where you've got the green showing lots of them. As you get away from the green, there are fewer of them. And if you kind of line this up with that temperature dipole, what you can start seeing is that they tend to be in those areas, fewer birds associated with these lower temperatures. So what we found over time, and that's really actually the value of the covariance analysis, is that this is a fairly robust pattern where almost always we start seeing this idea that they are not in areas that tend to be cold, and they tend to be positively associated with warmer areas during that eruption year. How about another species? So this is purple finch here. So purple finch, we actually found a lot more evidence for that boom phenomenon, meaning that we look at many species or many individuals and few individuals, and we can see that sort of hotspot of tree seed production there in the Northeast. And so if you actually looked at that spatial pattern again, you can start seeing that during that eruption year, they tend to be going to areas with lots of seed production, lots of mass in the environment, right? And again, over time, they tend to be really strongly correlated in terms of the emergence of those two spatial patterns. One more example, pine siskin. So this was actually a really good species for that bust phenomenon. So in this case, you've got the time lag of whether or not they're going to be sort of vacating areas in which there was a lot of seed production the year before. So much more of that indirect effect. And that's exactly what you see there in the Northeast, lots of seed production going on the year before the eruption dynamic. During the eruption, that's when you start seeing fewer individual birds. And again, strong correlation as to sort of when that emergence of that spatial pattern in a resource happens, and when you actually start seeing that spatial pattern in the bird data. So as I mentioned, we looked at several different species. I just want to give you some sort of general take on that, at least the strengths of evidence that we found across this whole suite of species. So up there, you'll basically see a whole group of species for the minimum temperature hypothesis. We've got seed production there in the boom, and we've got sort of evidence or support for the bust. And what you'll see there on the 0 to 1 or -1 to 1 is basically the strengths of that correlation. So let's first look at white-winged crossbill. That was the species that we were kind of using as an example, right? Very strong positive relationship to temperature. So what that's generally meaning is that they're seeking out warmer areas during that eruption time, during that eruption year. That purple finch, more the boom, generally during the eruption year, much more likely to actually be associated with areas with lots of mass. The pine siskin, you can see over here, more of that bust. So negatively correlated in those years with in the year before, had a lot of mass and high seed production. So when we look at these three species, we find pretty good support. And this is what we found when we look at most species, okay, which is actually a bit of a mixed bag. So I would say that for the most part, most species tended to be sort of in line with that climate variability hypothesis during their eruption year, right? So ultimately, we had about 7 of these species with, roughly about correlation coefficient of 0.3, basically in suggest or strong evidence that for a lot of these species, they tend to be fleeing those colder areas, seeking out warmer areas during that very sort of those colder conditions during that eruption year. In terms of the boom, a little bit of a mixed bag, but I would also say, pretty strong support, at least for 5 of these species, where they are actually seem to be looking for, following up and trying to find these areas of high seed production. And also some support for the bust for some species, right? So some species also will show they tend to be fleeing those areas where you do have a lot of high seed production. And clearly for the resource variability hypothesis, you're kind of capturing both phenomenon here for the boom and the bust. But what I would leave you with overall is that there does seem to be good support here for both of these hypotheses actually playing out, where you got these dipoles, both in climate and resource availability, that are setting up and actually are actually really important for constraining these eruption dynamics. So just to kind of take you through some other things that we've been finding, which I think has been really interesting. One, okay, just to leave you with first that conclusion, that these climate dipoles and resource dipoles seem to be really important features underlying these eruption dynamics, which are strongly evolved in many of these species, right? Where they go, the periodicity of those eruption dynamics, and also sort of how that geography may be changing. One of these things we did find just looking at the climate data is that these dipoles, especially in terms of temperature, actually have their origins halfway across the world. So what you see in these sort of climate dynamics is that in Southeast Asia, during monsoon events, you get this sort of release of energy into the atmosphere. And this actually sets up this atmospheric wave in climate conditions that then propagates across the hemisphere and sets up here in North America. So when we talk about sort of the origins of some of these climate dipoles for North America, it actually sets up sort of these Rossby waves that set up across the hemisphere and actually then constrain all these different climate dipoles within North America, and then obviously their subsequent effects on the bird eruption dynamics. So in terms of some of the implications here a little bit, certainly from an ecological perspective, but also, clearly with evolutionary implications as well, is that there does seem to be strong support that these underlying dipoles, both in terms of the climate and resources, are really important in terms of constraining the ecology of many of these species. In particular, what we've been really interested in is, are there certain traits that have evolved over time that may make certain species more or less sensitive to this variation, both in terms of these climate and or resource dipoles? Kind of thinking moving forward, what we have noticed actually interesting over when we look at over time is that these eruption dynamics can sort of form and actually disappear over time. So there have definitely been periods that we still don't quite know why, but some of these eruption dynamics will actually disappear or become much less structured and then reform. And you can see this over 50 to 60 years. And part of what we are beginning to think about is that what we're seeing here in the climate system is an increasing synchrony in a lot of weather and climate patterns that can be imposing changes in the frequency and periodicity of those eruption events. So if that didn't really convince you about ecological dipoles, I'm going to kind of walk you through some other examples, just thinking broadly about why dipoles might be important. So there's been really interesting work thinking about recovery of ecosystems following big disturbances like forest fires. So in this case, what they have shown is that recovery from forest fires, especially things like juvenile recruitment, actually tends to be limited by precipitation dipole, especially in the Western United States. And so what this paper and other studies have kind of shown is that this dipole and precipitation actually is a really important constraint on whether or not ecosystems, or at least the speed by which ecosystems can recover from these big disturbances like forest fires. Another kind of really interesting example too is actually the fact that dipoles also exist within marine systems. So there's something referred to as an Indian Ocean dipole, which is just this idea, again, that you got sort of warmer conditions that set up in one part of the Indian Ocean compared to cooler conditions in the other, and this flips. And they call it a positive negative phasing of that Indian Ocean dipole. And what they have found with king penguins is that they are really sensitive to where the thermocline happens in terms of the transition from sort of warm to cold conditions. That's where they go feed on fish. During really positive phasings of the IOD, the Indian Ocean dipole, what they have shown is that these adults have to go farther and farther out to get fish, which basically means they spend less time on the nest, less time taking care of their young. And certainly during 1 year, 1997, I think it is, where they had a really strong positive phasing of that Indian Ocean dipole, they actually saw a 30 to 40% decline in the population, primarily because the adults had to go so far to go get the resources to bring back to their young. Another interesting aspect characteristic of dipoles is that we've been thinking about this kind of like ENSO, 3 to 5 year kind of cycling, but it actually, many of these dipoles can persist for thousands of years. And so there's been really neat reconstruction data on sort of being able to look at, especially in the Amazonian basin, whether or not you have these precipitation dipoles that can ultimately flip from one sort of phasing to another over 20, 25,000 years. And so just imagine what that may mean in terms of biodiversity, right? Where you get certain conditions that persist for over thousands of years, and then you get the inversion of those conditions. and what that could actually do in terms of biodiversity and the refugia of biodiversity over time. And this has got us a lot of thinking about this idea that you can have these dipoles associated with different modes of climate variability, right? Some of them that may have 1,500-year periodicity, some of them that have more like 3 to 5 year periodicity, and some of them like the Arctic Oscillation, which is almost interannual variability. What happens when they all lock up? You can imagine that there may be certain periods of time where you have what's referred to as phase locking, where you get very strong positive phasing of all these different modes of climate variability. And we've done some work to show like, yeah, that really does happen. And those conditions can be really important for ecological phenomenon in terms of these episodic sort of changes, both in terms of where species are being affected, but also potentially for sort of broader patterns of biodiversity. And finally, I don't do this work. Maybe Aaron can weigh in on this, but there's definitely some kind of cool work out there suggesting that climate conditions are important for, human evolution, right? In terms of, especially for things like, the collapse of the Roman Empire or other kind of components out there, which have suggested that dipoles certainly can play a role in terms of things like especially drought that can set up and be timing or important for the timing of the human migration and human movement. Okay. So I'm just going to leave you with a couple sort of important take homes here. Now, one, these dipoles definitely are characteristics of climate variability. They're really well known. They tend to be very spatially structured, and they tend to vary in some predictable periodicity. What I would impart is that these really are a manifestation of these continental scale sort of connections. So when you see dipoles that emerge, it tends to be at a continental scale, but they do have these sort of global origins and global teleconnections. And really what I'm excited about is that we are entering sort of this new era of big data, especially in ecological responses, where we haven't really been able to look at these connections before because frankly, we haven't had continental scale databases. But now we do. Over the last 10 years, and certainly over the next 20 to 30 years, we're going to have ecological databases that basically rival what we have in terms of climatological data. And now we are able to explore not just whether or not climate dipoles persist, but the emergence of these ecological dipoles. And, certainly I'm not an evolutionary biologist, but I do think about the implications of this in terms of how species may evolve in response to these sort of predictable climate dipoles that emerge. Can it influence their migration patterns? Can it influence the development or evolution of their traits? And so I'll just kind of leave you with that. Certainly when I think about boreal bird eruptions, I like to think about it as the echocardiogram of the health of the boreal forest, because it is an inherent component of how the boreal forest works. And what we are beginning to see is that eruption, those eruption dynamics, the periodicity, the spatial nature of that is changing rapidly over time. And maybe this is some sort of indication then, sort of a further consequence of what we know about modern climate change, that these eruption dynamics may be changing now and may change in the future. And with that, we may have some time for questions. I'm happy to answer them.
There's some questions.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, very fascinating. You showed differences in responses to dipole changes between these species. I'm just curious, is there evidence or do you have reason to think that these factors might influence populations or subpopulations within species? And could that have an influence on something like speciation to go that?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. There's no doubt in the sense that, what we've seen with eruption dynamics, especially when we think of resource availability, is clearly a demographic mechanism. So we talk about it in terms of demographic pulses, right? Where, ultimately, if you got a boom and bust cycle in terms of a resource availability, that can influence demographic processes like reproduction and survival. So there's no doubt that at a population level or within populations, that certain populations may be more susceptible to these changes in these sort of dipoles. One of the things that we are beginning to sort of also untangle is that the geography of these dipoles may be shifting over time. The jet stream, obviously, is a really important component of where dipoles emerge, especially latitudinally. And one of the things that I think there's some debate about this, but whether or not that jet stream is effectively moving north. And if that's the case, then you can imagine that the associated dipoles will also be moving north, and then certain populations that may be more or less vulnerable to that shift you can imagine over time may be influenced by those conditions as well. Now, whether or not that kind of leads to speciation processes, yeah, I don't know. I think it's an outstanding question. But there's no doubt that in some respects, the fact that these are facultative migrants, that they do have some plasticity, that's inherent and important for them, how that plays out over evolutionary time is really, it's interesting to think about.
Curious about the concept of dipoles in the context of like glacial cycles. So like, say during a period of glacial maximum, would there be maybe more stability, less interannual variation in dipoles?
Oof, boy, I don't want to get into hot water here because I'm not a climate dynamicist. All right, maybe I'll go out on a limb and say yes, right? Like I do think during periods of, rapid warming or interglacial periods, I'm going to just kind of suggest that, yeah, potentially you have increased variability and really in terms of the climate system in of itself. And these dipoles are ultimately a characteristic of that climate variability, right? So if that is changing, I've heard some, although this is, again, I think hotly debated, that things like El Nino or ENSO, we think about it as 3 to 5 year periodicity. I think there are reconstructions that go back a few hundred years that suggest it used to be something like 30 years. Right. And so you can imagine then if the mode of that climate variability is changing like that over just a few hundred years, I can't imagine what they like kind of formed or didn't form or how they basically persisted over a big period of time between glacial and interglacial periods. Yeah.
About feedbacks back into the Swiss tree themselves. Are there certain species that are more important for the forest in general? And is there thinking about like maybe changes in the
it's a really good question. So for those who didn't hear, so basically the idea being that, are there certain species, let's say, of trees that may be important for like forest health that could be sort of influenced by the masting component or changes in the masting component. So yes, I would say that ultimately masting, I know that they found is really important for forest regeneration. Like that's the seed that kind of falls, right, and is important for like future regrowth. What they have shown is, I kind of simplified it, but it's called the delta T model, that ultimately when you get sort of massing happen, it's really a function of the 2 years before it in terms of the temperature change. And so you kind of have to have a big temperature change between sort of the 2 years before you get a masting event. So there has been a lot of work as to sort of, okay, if that's the case, are you expected to see changes in masting dynamics? Where if we got warming overall, I think what they're suggesting now is that we're not expected to see big changes overall in terms of masting dynamics, primarily because it's the difference between those 2 years before mast, as opposed to like needing a certain amount of like warming that happens. It really is the difference of delta between that. So I think in general that they're not expecting like climate change to have like completely disrupt masting dynamics. But I do think that they think that the geography of that masting may vary over time. And yeah, that's, I think, a pretty active area of exploration. But it definitely is important for forest ecosystems in terms of, being able to think about regeneration following disturbance and other components. Definitely spruce is a major component of boreal forests in the north. Yeah.
Just the one that made a comment in response to earlier question. Maybe my intuition is off, but it seems to me that climate dipoles would inhibit speciation and foraging new diversity, because if you have things moving around in eruptions, if you have things tracking different conditions in dipoles, that would inhibit local adaptation and the genetic isolation and make speciation more difficult. People have proposed that tropical rainforests are species rich because they're a stable environment.
Right.
Local adaptation is possible. It seems like the scenarios you're talking about would actually inhibit the evolution of these species.
It could totally be possible. The reason we don't quite know the subsequent effects on breeding. So meaning that when we talk about eruption dynamics, that's really happening during the non-breeding season. You got the movement of individuals, right? And then potentially and presumably they return back. So whether or not there's a subsequent effect on, let's say, gene flow, other components that might be important for speciation, I think that's a big unknown in terms of whether or not you got to have sort of different kinds of eruption or the periodicity of that eruption or eruption to new areas, whether or not there are individuals that kind of stay to actually contribute to that reproduction in the basically in the next season. So I think it's an outstanding question, honestly, as to whether or not those wintertime eruptions can have subsequent effects in terms of which individuals are where for breeding.
All right, well, we're right at the end of our time, so let's all give a big hand for questions.
Going over